We found that writing a YouTube script usually makes for stronger retention and increases views. The problem is that writing a YouTube video usually takes me and many other YouTubers a very long time. So in this episode, George and Gwilym, who have written scripts for multi-million subscriber YouTube channels, coach me on how to speed up my script writing process. So George, this morning I had the thought that I need to write ideally 2 YouTube videos, but at least 1. Just because I'm heading to Vid Summit in a couple of weeks and I'd love to give my editor some videos to work on. And I have like this idea bank of like 50 different video ideas, loads of them different series, but sometimes it's just like, I have to, write a script. It always feels like an absolute mountain to get started. And sometimes if I get over that hurdle and really get into the zone, I can do it in like 45 minutes to an hour. So get to like a really good spot. But there's just like this friction. And I've seen this a few times with clients that I've worked with where they just don't like writing scripts. They prefer to just write bullet points. And sometimes I feel that because I'm like, it's so much more enjoyable to just bullet point and riff. But I know from working for many YouTubers now that comparing the retention graphs of riffs versus scripts, scripting is almost always better. And when I know this knowledge, I feel like I have to do that, right? And that in a way does suck some of the fun out of it. But I want to spend a bit of time on this episode just like interviewing you giving some tips to kind of like, how can we speed up the editing, the script writing process or the script editing process, make it more enjoyable and actually, get started with making the video. So this isn't like a checkbox exercise where we have to complete it before we can move on to the next steps of actually recording. So do you have any like general thoughts on that so far?
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing. And it's like, I feel like we've been living through this kind of period where script writing is really coming into its own in the YouTube space. And there are a lot more people. First, it was a wave of maybe editors, then a wave of strategists and thumbnail designers. Now there's kind of more of a wave of people who are advertising themselves as script writers. And so I think for maybe the last 2 years, I felt some real momentum behind this idea that like script writing is a thing. And oh God, it's really hard to find script writers, but everybody needs one. And side note, that's probably because people probably a lot of the time feel what you do, where it's like, I really know I should, but it's a real frictiony thing. And so if I could get someone to do it for me, then that would just be great. That has its own troubles and trials and tribulations. But this is something that a lot of my students have been expressing as well. And when I released the first version of my course, everyone was kind of like, the idea was like, here is my complete script writing system. Here's how to do everything well, as far as I can tell from my experience. Here's the system to try and implement, and off you go. And one of the big pieces of feedback that came from that was like, yes, that's an ideal world, but like, what is the 80-20 of this? How do I do this if I am working a full-time job, or if I, whatever, like maybe I've got a kid, or I just don't have the time to spend 10, 20 hours on every single script. And there's a few things to talk about. So like, I'm interested to get from both of you kind of how your, clients that you've worked with deal with this and what the general approach is. From guys that you've worked with and girls that you've worked with. But I think for me, like the biggest thing when it comes to a YouTube script is just the structure, and that'll probably come as no surprise to a lot of people. And I think that's the issue with riffing a lot of the time, is that you lose a sense of what the overall flow of the video is. Even if you go into it and you sit down knowing what you want to talk about and you know what the final point is that you want to make, in the moment, there are always those sections where you think, wait, did I address this already? Did I mention this point? And if I didn't mention it, then can I mention this next thing? And if I, you know what I mean? Just like it's a lot harder to keep track of the topics you've covered and therefore what you can set up next in the story or in the script. And so for me, like, and maybe we're answering the question super quickly here, but like the 80-20 of it is the structure. And so. But
I want to jump in here. Like, when it comes to the structure, how are you defining that? Because for me, for example, when I'm in this process, I go to the hook because I feel like the hook really sets up the rest of the video structure. And I really like the PPP framework, which is proof, promise, and plan. That really, for an educational video, is like, here's the proof of I've done the thing that I'm educating you about, or this is my background. The promise of like, this is the outcome. This is what you're going to get by the end of the video. Sort of the transformation. and then there's the plan, right? These are the 10 points. This is the roadmap. This is the blueprint. That usually gets people to buy in. And for me, from a writing perspective, I find that really useful. But that is if I just have a direct talking to camera video where it's nothing too special. Sometimes I have this idea of like, oh, what if I, remade a YouTuber's thumbnail, and I broke it down into the design aspect, and then the sort of the psychological clickable aspect of it, of like what made someone actually click, and have this really fancy edit. And then all of a sudden I'm like, this now just feels like I've built up this mountain that I have to climb. But this is the stuff that will make a really good video. Like, this is what hard feels like for making a creative original video. And a lot of the times it's like, this is a lot of work for something that might not work. And I think that's okay, but it just stops you in your tracks and think, I've got other things that I need to be doing. I don't have much time. And I think that's where a lot of the entrepreneurs in this space as well, that's where they go, I don't have the time to commit to this. I'll go get Scriptwriter. So when it comes to that structure, like, what type of structures are we talking about? Just like a direct talking to camera, an entertainment YouTube channel? Like, what do you think of?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. So I think primarily what we're going to be talking about here is probably more educational stuff. But at its base, like, I'm just going to talk through the different kind of levels that I think of when I'm thinking of script writing as a whole. So for me, there are like 3 different levels that you can write a script at. Level 1, and this is really applicable to both education and entertainment, is that you sit down, you do your brainstorm. Maybe you like limit yourself to 10 minutes or something like that. And you're like, okay, what are all the things that could happen in this video, or all the things that I probably do need to talk about at some point? And you don't need to worry about the structure at this point. You're just thinking like, what theoretically might go in, what B-roll ideas might I have? Like, is there anything I'm picturing when I had this idea on the train or in the shower or whatever? What was it I was picturing? And you write all that stuff down. And then to basically turn that into a level 1 script, you essentially identify what the key payoffs are in that video. So like, payoffs being something that, I don't want to over-explain payoffs to people, but it's like those little moments in the video where the audience learns something new, or they experience something exciting, or they progress in some way towards that ultimate goal of the video, whatever it is. And a level 1 script basically stops there. It's identifying in relation to your audience, the people that you've identified that you're targeting with this video, which is another thing we could talk about for a while, like identifying who your audience is, but identifying the most interesting payoffs for that audience and arranging them in a way that they kind of build on each other and they build up towards whatever that final thing is. And now with an entertainment video, a lot of the time, like, that's going to be kind of where you have to stop anyway, because in a lot of cases you're then going out and you're doing whatever that thing is. So if you think of like, it might be a challenge video, or it might be like whatever it is, or you're going out into public and you're doing something. You might think, roughly speaking, here is the order of events that I think I'm gonna need that are going to happen today. Then you go out and film it. Then you come back and you kind of write some voiceover to tie it together. And so it's harder to give more advice on the structure for that side of things. But in terms of the actual script you need to write beforehand, it's like, what are the key beats of this thing I'm going to go and do? And then I'll go out and maybe it will happen that way, maybe it won't. But then with an educational video, it's much the same. You're identifying those key beats, those key payoffs that happen at the end of a segment, making sure they build up to the final point, and then you're kind of done. And the reason this type of this level of script writing, level 1 script writing as I call it, is so useful is that you basically then, that's it. You have these kind of guardrails that get you from the hook, as you said, Jamie. Like, that's obviously something that's super important. I usually encourage people to write that word for word, regardless of how much time they have. Like,
I do.
Yeah. Okay, good. That's the most important bit initially. But the second point in a video where retention dips the most, in like the hundreds of graphs that I've reviewed at this point, the first one is the hook. Obviously, you're always going to lose like 20, 30, 40% of people during those first 30 seconds. But those moments between segments where you hit a payoff and then the next segment of the video begins, there are always dips in those moments. So like with a listicle, a lot of the time you'll see the spiky graphs because people are skipping ahead to whatever the next point is. But even if it's not a listicle, those moments in between segments where the audience potentially feels a bit lost and they don't know what the next 2 minutes of the video is going to be about, those are the moments where your attention starts to wander. And so like that's why a level 1 script works, and that's what you're thinking of basically, is like, what is the next payoff? As soon as I finish this segment, what's the next payoff that we're going to be building towards? And I think that just kind of focuses your mind, even if you then riff on the day. you've at least got a very clear picture of what the next point is that you're building towards.
When it comes to those payoffs, how do you identify what is a significant payoff? And like, because whenever I hear the word payoff, it's like, oh yeah, you need to have at least 3 payoffs, and they need to happen at like, if it's a 10-minute video, every 3 minutes, and then you need to rehook them. And then it almost just feels like I've created a structure where the content might not want to fit into that structure. It almost feels like there is the structure that we're selling to people, when actually kind of anything can go. It's like, how do we identify those moments? Because I usually just feel like, okay, what is a significant payoff here? Because I kind of just go straight to the end of the video of like, for example, if I was reviewing and remaking a thumbnail, seeing the final product is at the end. So then what have I got to do for like those 8 minutes in between? And then I feel like, have I got to fabricate these payoffs and insert them in? And it just feels like now I've got a solution. I'm trying to find a problem for it, rather than here's my problem, and now I have a bunch of different solutions to choose from.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a good point, and I think that is often one of the struggles is making sure you're not feeling disingenuous and like you're taking your audience for a ride and you're just like padding for time because longer watch time. It just, that's something that you don't want to feel like you're consciously doing. But I think the way that there's 2 things to talk about really. We could talk about how to insert those payoffs naturally, and the other thing is kind of a mindset thing. And I think I'll start with that. So like for me, the mindset thing about this is you're not delaying giving the ultimate payoff at the end, like the grand payoff as I call it. You're not delaying giving the audience the answer they came for because you're trying to pad for time. It's more that if you can find a more interesting way of explaining what it is you're trying to explain, or showing what it is you're showing, if it's an entertainment video, you create a more memorable experience and a more memorable lesson, or whatever it could be, that's more likely to stick with the audience, more likely to actually then influence what they do next, which is ultimately the purpose of a lot of content on YouTube. So that's like a mindset thing, if that makes sense. But then in terms of figuring out what is a worthwhile payoff, I think the issue with the word payoff is that it sometimes implies like it needs to be something more grandiose than it actually does. And there's another bit of terminology which I'll maybe talk about in a bit when I want to talk about level 2 scripting as well. A lot of the time, because we're trying to label these different segments and these different things that go into a YouTube script, it can make it feel more pressure filled than it actually needs to be. So with the example of like a thumbnail related video, what are some of the things you might talk about in a video like that?
I guess it would most likely be showing the original that's underperformed. Stating to people like, I'm going to show them how they could improve the title and the thumbnail from a clickability perspective, and then also breaking down the raw assets and building a new thumbnail from the ground up, and showing either that in real time or just the highlights of rebuilding that, and then kind of like saying, ta-da, here is the new after packaging, and comparing it to the before and just sort of explaining why it would work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's cool. That makes a lot of sense. Well, I mean, for me, that there is, and one quick thing to say, because I know you mentioned, does it need to be 1 payoff every X number of minutes, or does it need to be 3 payoffs in a 10-minute video or whatever? One thing to say out the gate is that basically, I don't think in those terms ever. I never have a set number of length that there needs to be between payoffs, or a certain number within a video. So with something like that, what comes to mind naturally is like, initially the first thing I want to talk about might be something more zoomed out and more kind of conceptual about packaging YouTube videos, like generally. So not necessarily going into the specific aspects of the thumbnail you're talking about transforming, but just zooming out and being like, okay, what we need to cover the kind of bedrock of packaging a YouTube video first. So eventually that's how I would be thinking about, you'd have to think about what the exact payoff would be, but there will be something related to this like broader thesis of how packaging on YouTube works. That would be the payoff that I would be thinking at the end of that first segment, whatever it might be. Like, maybe the payoff is simply as simple as it's about psychological clickability, not design or something like that, which a lot of people may know, but if you're breaking down a thumbnail, that's what people are clicking to watch. That might be a novel point for them. So that's how I would think about that first payoff. And then the rest of the payoffs, I'd just be thinking specific aspects of the design of that thumbnail. So maybe maybe there's a segment that's on people's expressions. Maybe there's a segment on rule of 3 and showing different examples of how rule of 3 can be used really effectively, and then where people didn't use rule of 3 effectively and why it looks bad. And so it's like, for me, it's just breaking down what the different aspects of that thumbnail are and allowing yourself the time to teach those, even though they might seem simplistic points, in a more memorable way. So like we were saying, rule of three, if the revelation for somebody watching the video is at the end of that particular segment, you're talking about rule of three, and they realize, okay, cool, from now on in my thumbnails, I'm going to use rule of three. But sure, you could just say that out the gate, only use 3 elements in your thumbnails as a starting point. That's a good general rule of thumb. It might work better, and it might be a more memorable lesson to show a bunch of different examples separate to the thing that you're talking about, to the thumbnail that you're transforming, and showing in practice, like, here are a bunch of thumbnails that work really well. But this is at the point where you haven't said rule of three is the payoff yet. You haven't given that clue, but you're showing a bunch of thumbnails. Why do these work well? And then a bunch of other thumbnails. Now these ones, they don't work so well. Can you figure out why that is? And all this kind of like this visual way of teaching people stuff, it seems like you could just say out the gate, rule of three is a good rule of thumb, go with that. But that more visual way of showing it is potentially a more memorable lesson because you're forcing people to engage, you're asking them questions, you're making them really look. And by the time you get to that payoff that, oh, rule of three is the point of this section, that's why we're talking about it, it's more of a euphoric kind of like, oh, yes, okay, that's good. Because that's kind of what I thought when I was looking at those thumbnails. I'd never heard of that concept before. But like, yes, now I'm really attuned to what rule of three looks like when done well and when done badly. That was a hell of a tangent and a bit of a spiel, but I think it's like that's the mindset that I'm trying to get into with when I'm thinking about payoffs. It's not that I'm trying to waste the audience's time. It's just I've got maybe a simplistic lesson at the end of each segment, but like what is the most visually interesting and emotionally engaging way that I can tell that story, that give that point so that they remember it.
So something I'm noticing. So we're talking about how can I make writing scripts easier, right? And something I'm noticing that we're talking about, we're kind of assuming, and Jamie's doing it already, is Jamie is talking about a format of video that he's already got an idea of what he wants to do. So I want to do this type of video about talking about analyzing a thumbnail. Even before you start scripting, you're setting yourself up for success or failure by just idea selection. And I think that might be the most important part of whether your scripting is going to be hellish long experience or very brief. It's like, which rock do you want to drag up the hill? This small one or this massive one? And generally, the difference is how much do you already know about this already? How much can you talk up to a friend about it? So, like, a channel that I've been thinking about a lot recently with script writing, or lack thereof, is Renaissance Periodization, run by this guy, Mike Israetel. And it's basically a Reacts channel, but he's a professor of sports science, and he will just sit down. He'll like, today we're talking about this person's exercise routine. He will react to the exercise routine. And it's not scripted, but he has bullet points he wants to hit. And he already knows the stuff inside out so well that he can generate these perfect videos. So Jamie's kind of going in a similar direction where you already know a lot about thumbnails, Jamie, so it makes sense for you to select a format where you can start script writing around something you already know. And so probably the starting advice I'd give to someone who's worried about script writing or is saying it's taking too long is, are you like a camel living off its hump? Have you already got the information in your hump that you can just kind of get out there? Or are you having to go and find this information and talk about stuff you have no idea about? Because if you're going to do that, it's going to be so much harder. And yeah, once you're on to this stage of like, okay, I want to script it, if you have checked off the box of, yes, I know what I'm talking about, yes, I have information to impart to the viewer, the next point is like, are you very clear on what the idea is? Have you got the clarity? And that's, I think, I mean, I don't know if you agree with this, George, but I feel like that's the threshold at which you can then start stage one script writing.
Yeah, no, I do agree with that. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Cool.
I think this is really interesting because I think this is like good stuff, right? Because I feel like we're slowly cleaning things up and everything's going a little bit cleaner, because I think there's a difference, right, between like we're using the words like format, right, for a format of a video, right? Because and we use the word series, and we're also using the word structure here, and it's like these are words for like framework, right? Like it's very much like there are constraints here. And whenever I'm making YouTube videos, I like to think, how can I make this repeatable series? because if people enjoy the video, they usually want to watch the exact same thing again, but slightly different. So in this particular case, it would be like, here's thumbnail A, and I'm going to turn it into thumbnail B and improve it, right? That's video 1. People like it. Okay, we're going to do video 2, but it's going to be a completely different thumbnail. So when I'm sat there in Notion this morning and I'm like, okay, this is a video that I know would be valuable. I have the information in my head. I like where this would go, but what's the structure, right? Like that's where I'm thinking, what's the structure of this video? And that's why my question initially to you, George, was, what is a structure? Because it always feels like I'm trying to fit this information into something that's already built. In the sense of like, we have a listicle, we know it goes 1 through 10, and that's pretty much it. Or if we have like a storytelling narrative, we tend to have the hero's journey. Like this to me is sort of like the structure of a script that we're looking at. And when you have a video like what I want to create, which is a bit more creative, it's a bit more abstract, it's like, how does this fit into a structure? And I think when you're talking about a level 1 video structure, in my head, the word structure is like this thing I need to fit the information into, whereas I think it's more like there are elements to a script. So for level 1, the elements that you're referring to are the payoffs. So it's kind of like, I can imagine I have this bucket of different elements, and level 1, all that I have inside of this bucket is payoffs. And that's what I can then apply to this script idea that I have, rather than it being a narrative structure. Because that is what I think when I think of the word structure, as I kind of like this element bucket. And then it's like level 2, you get the payoffs plus whatever you're going to tell us is in level 2. And it's like, I can now apply those to the script. And so the script video to video might change in the early days when I'm trying to determine what this format is. And then once I've got this format that I know works and I've analyzed the retention and I've made those tweaks, then I can get the flywheel going of just producing multiple videos in this format where the thumbnails are changing video to video and people like it. Does that make sense? Like, I feel like we're kind of uncovering a little bit, because I think there's so much, like the semiotics of words is important, because the words that you use paint a picture in your head. And I kind of think like we're slowly uncovering something, but maybe I'm wrong.
So we've covered formats and having a repeatable structure. We've covered stage 1 script writing, which is, do you have a series of payoffs in mind? Is that a fair summary? And what is level 2?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. And I totally hear what you're saying, Jamie. I think, I don't want the idea of structure to make, like, constraints can be good. And like you said, finding a repeatable series and a structure that you can then constrain yourself with next time is useful and time saving. But I agree, like, that can also be, the idea of structure can feel like a barrier if it makes you feel like the hero's journey thing. Like, I never thought in terms of that. Like, when I was working with Mike Shake in terms of entertainment stuff, we never spoke about a hero's journey or anything like that. Maybe there's an argument, maybe some strategists or script writers would be like, oh no, you should have done, and here's how the videos could have been 10 times better if you had. But I never think like that. I think you're right. It's more about, elements, I think was the word you used. Making sure there are certain elements in the video, but not constraining yourself to a particular structure, if that's going to be the friction that then means you then don't write anything at all. So I think we kind of aligned on that. And then, Gwilym, to your question, like, level 2 is really not much different to level 1, and all it does is introduces a second element, which is kind of tied to the element we just talked about in terms of payoffs. The reason I'm like stumbling a bit is because I always feel like it's actually quite difficult to write a level 1 script, because you naturally just end up writing a level 2 script. And that is basically thinking more, just more consciously about the setup for each payoff. So like I was saying before, those moments, those transition moments between segments. And again, we're saying segments. This does not mean there is a set where you have to put those segments next to each other. It's just in your mind breaking the video down into these segments, which lead up to a payoff of some sort at the end of each one. Level 2 scripting is thinking, okay, how can I most effectively and most interestingly essentially re-hook the viewer and set up the payoff at the end of this segment? Because those are the moments where their minds are likely to wander. And unless you can kind of root their kind of interest in this video in the payoff that's coming up, every time you move to a new segment, that's another opportunity for them to think, do I actually care about this? Like, why did I even click on this video in the first place? I feel like I've kind of got the gist of this. I could probably go away and do my own thing, or like whatever. but thinking very consciously and writing word for word in the way that you would the hook, where possible, where you have the time, writing the setup for each new segment, which can be as simple as a sentence. So like if we're talking the thumbnail video we were discussing before, it might be like, so we've concluded this first segment, which is on the bedrock information about how packaging works with like titles and thumbnails. And then the setup for the next one might be something like, so, you know, I hate templatizing this kind of transition, but it's just an example. It's like, so now we understand how titles work in relation to packaging. We can talk about, so maybe you wouldn't say rule of three because you don't want to give it away, but you could set up the next segment, which might be rule of three, because now they've understood the title. Now we can talk about the three elements in the thumbnail, one of which might be a piece of text, which is again going to be intrinsically linked to the title. But they had to understand the thing about titles packaging initially before we could then talk about rule of three. So I don't know the way you would set that up without giving away the fact that it's rule of three, but those being precise with those transition sentences, I think, is really, really important. And that's level 2 scripting, and I don't think it takes much longer than level 1. It's just thinking very clearly about those setup and the payoff of each segment, and still obviously writing the hook as we spoke about before. But I'm curious to get your thoughts on that, and like whether that feels like something that is still like too high lift, or whether that would disrupt the riffing that you come to later on. Like, yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I can see how you made the point that level 1 tends to turn into level 2, because I would feel like if I was writing a payoff as a level 1, for it to even be sort of a payoff, it has to be set up, right? So it automatically moves up into being a level 2. I do like the idea of having a loose sort of structure around the payoffs for each point. If I was going to keep this like a relatively minimal scripted, quite an easy script to make, because if I just wanted to riff, and I've seen this before, like you riff and it's all good, and then you watch it back and you're like, oh, I could have done this, could have done that. But getting your list of bullet points written beforehand, and then thinking a little bit about what's the setup, what's the payoff, and actually writing those word for word. If you have multiple of them throughout the video and you're using a teleprompter to read that word for word, you kind of, how I've always described it is, it's like you're on rails, right, for the hook, because you've written that word for word, and then you kind of get to that first point that you set up, that's written word for word, and then you kind of drift a little bit as you're, making your point just based on what you've read on the bullet point and then whatever comes to mind. And then you kind of go straight back onto the track again for the payoff. And then that leads into the next setup point. And like that in a video's context could be like 30 to 60 seconds. And then you go off again and you rant a bit, and then you get pulled back. And I think when you have that nature throughout the entirety of the video, you do get to that 80-20 point that we were talking about at the beginning of the video, where for the majority of the video, from a viewer's perspective, it's really good, and you are getting the value in that setup and payoff, and it's just that the bit in between is, I think, where the personality comes out a little bit more. And I think that's where it's needed, because if you don't have that, then you do just sound like a robot talking to the camera, reading from a teleprompter. So yeah, the level 2 makes complete sense to me.
Gwilym, do you have any thoughts on level 2? And is this, because I know obviously we've barely touched on the fact that you wrote, you were Annie's Annie? Did I say Annie? Well, I meant Ali. His kind of like main scriptwriter when we were all working with him, and I'm curious to like, does any of this speak to how you would think about scripts, or is this totally different?
The general plague whenever you're talking about something that you do in practice, in theory, is that it's very easy to kind of say, oh, this is kind of how I guess, I theorize about how I do the thing, this is how I do the thing, but you actually do the thing very differently. And I find it hard to, I haven't thought about how to communicate around script writing that much, not half as much as you have. And so in my mind, it's like, I just do the thing, and and if it seems crap, I will change it. But I think it's really useful for beginners maybe to think about how we naturally gauge the retention of the audience, aka the person we're talking to in real life. And everyone has had this feedback loop so many times that we kind of know how to tell stories on a basic level. So you don't say, oh, I tripped over my neighbor's cat yesterday. Oh, okay. How did that happen? No, you say, oh, something crazy happened to me yesterday. Okay, hook. So, my neighbor got a new cat, right? Necessary information. So I was walking out the front door carrying all of the fucking laundry, and this blur of black and white ran across in front of me. Okay, this is your kind of rambly freestyling section. And then I fell, I face planted, and I don't know, whatever happened, and the cat ran away screaming. That's kind of more entertaining.
Yeah,
this is genius. This is like the
entertaining.
cleanest analogy I've ever seen.
So everyone knows how to do this, but then when we get to script writing, it's like, oh, what's a hook? What's a setup? And if you're trying to entertain someone and give him information, just follow that kind of rule. Obviously, I think when people overdo it, it comes across as something insane has happened in China and you won't believe what it is. We're going to find out soon. That's annoying. But as long as you just inject enough of your natural storytelling ability, I think it'll be kind of basically there. And yeah, my second thought is, what you were talking about with scripting the intro, scripting the outro, scripting the payoffs. It's kind of like if you imagine, okay, I don't know if this is a great comparison, but it's like your script in its most unorganized format is like a massive fat snake. And what you're doing with the intro is you're pinching the snake, so the beginning is thin, and then you can go out into your unstructured rambling, and then each payoff is like another pinching of the snake. So you're like, there's these bottlenecks, and if you wanted to, you could make, I don't know, the flow or whatever be thin and very concise the whole way through by scripting everything, but that would take you ages. And so, yeah, I don't know, I like thinking of it in terms of like narrowing, opening up, narrowing. And if it's just open the whole way through, then you've got to be a hell of a good public speaker to make it work, or to be just speaking from the heart. That's my brain dump of thoughts.
I love that. I like you've been sort of relatively quiet until now, and then delivered some of the most incredible dialogue I think I've ever heard on this podcast. In the last minute. Unscripted, there you go. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of looking at it. And I think actually that's a really necessary point, is that idea of thinking, like stopping overthinking it for a second and thinking, hang on, you talk to people in your day-to-day life. How would you tell this story? How would you make this point interesting if you were doing it to them? And I think actually one of my students in my community has, they basically speak to this point that they had now started limiting how much time they spend, like literally setting a timer, I think 10 minutes for the entire thing, for this like kind of level 1, level 2 script, because they find if they have too many notes or too many bullet points, that actually they completely, it starts to feel like they can't just talk like they would like to talk, and therefore it takes more time and it generates a worse kind of output. So one thing I hadn't said is that level 2 scripting, really, you can then, and what I encourage people to do, and what I've done when I've been writing level 2 scripts, is like I'm still bullet pointing all the material that gets me from the setup to the payoff in each segment. But that's very much, up for debate. That's up for whatever feels best for you. And I think that's the point where this student of mine feels like if I do all these in between points, if I don't allow myself to naturally get from the setup to the payoff, then it just doesn't feel like me anymore. And so, like you say, Gwilym, I think taking that step back and just being a person and talking, as long as you have, as you say, Jamie, those kind of guardrails that get you from A to B, B to C, that might just be a more natural stopping point for some people.
I really like the actionable tip of setting a timer as well, because again, like that constraint, I think really forces you to think and to lay it down quite quickly, because I think otherwise you do tend to fall into overthinking, or this is going to take a lot longer than I think it will, and that's when you've built this mountain of work, and that's when people quit, or I'll do it for another day, and that work doesn't disappear when you come back another day. It's still there, and it just feels harder.
This lines up with how we prepare for podcasts as well, where what we're going to talk about today, then we spend maybe a couple minutes, but then we know that beyond those couple minutes, we will start overthinking it. And so we usually say, okay, let's get into it before we lose the urgency. So I like that. I think something that can help as well is thinking of it as when you're recording, it's not like, oh my God, we're recording, we can only do it once. You can watch it back and do it again if you want to.
Yeah.
With more
I've
information.
actually found as well recently, recording, when I have been reading from a teleprompter word for word, I just can't get like the personality across, and it feels really rigid. And I usually record about half of the script, and then they go, oh, I don't like this. And I go back to the beginning, and then it's really good. And it's just like this thing that you kind of have to get over. Or I'll record the entire video and then go back and do it as a second pass. And I'm now trying to get it into my head of like, okay, you've written a script, but it doesn't mean the script's bad if you're sat there recording and it's not just flowing. Because there's many times I've written a word for word script and it looks good, right? In my head when I'm reading it, I will say it out loud as I'm editing and I'm like, this all sounds good. And the second I hit the record button, I'm like, oh, I need to change this here. I need to move that sentence around. I need to edit that word. And it's because it's just not flowing out of me. And then I find I go through it and then it works. And I'm starting to say to myself, okay, I need to record videos twice as a minimum. Because I think just by doing that, you actually end up with a better product. Because if you compare it to like a singer-songwriter, when they're, writing their song and then they get in the booth to record it, they don't nail it first time. They probably go through it like 100 times. And then you have to think that each of those verses is usually clipped as like a single verse. And there's probably like recorded over months and months. And then they're all merged together to sound like one coherent song. And we just see that final product. But that there is, I think, a pressure on YouTubers to be like, oh, you just kind of have to nail it first time, right? Or just like record and upload. Why can't you record it 2 or 3 times? And it reminds me of something I saw from Ed Sheeran years ago, where he was talking about songwriting and writing down, for us, I guess it would be a script, where he would write and it would be terrible. And he just couldn't get it to work. And he compared it to a faucet where you turn this tap and there'd be dirty water blocking this tap, right? The pipe was blocked and there was a little bit of water coming through, but not a lot. And he says after a couple of minutes, it starts to clear. The water starts to become crystal clear because it's pushed through all of the dirt, and then he's into the flow. And that's when he can write these really good songs. And I think it's probably a similar thing for not just the script writing process, but also the recording process in relation to what you've written down. What do you guys think about that?
I think that totally speaks to my experience. Like, there have been occasions where I've screen recorded a long tutorial for something, and then I'll discover something in the edit that makes it unusable for whatever reason. Like, I took my shirt off and did a lap of the room or something that I just totally forgot about, and it obviously can't go out.
Retention spike.
Yeah, or but whatever. But then actually, it's kind of a joy because there's this part of me that's like, it was maybe like 60% okay, and maybe I could have put it out. But then as soon as I sit down to record it again, there's this freedom that I feel that comes over me, and it's like, oh yeah, I remember getting to this point in the tutorial last time and I said something that was a bit janky. This is all obviously happening in like a split second in your head, but you can then just go a slightly different way with it. And so yeah, I like that. And maybe this is something I haven't tried, but off the back of what you said, if you know you're gonna record something 2 or 3 times, maybe you do one where you're like, okay, I've got a level 2 script that has the setup and the payoffs and nothing else. You maybe try another one where it's like, I've got bullet points. And maybe you try another one, a level 3 script, which may as well just touch on is just fully word for word written. You could try it with different amounts of detail in the script and just see what comes out maybe.
Yeah, I've definitely had the experience of recording a voice note or screen recording, being like, damn, I messed something up, I'm going to do it again. And it's always, always, always the case that the second one will be shorter. Like if the first recording was 8 minutes, the second one will be 6.5. Because even if the content is not different, you're not umming and ahhing, you're saying things cleaner, everything is more precise and focused. And that is what we always tell clients that works well on YouTube, like information density. So yeah, I'm not sure if we're reassuring people who are like, oh, how can I spend less time on my YouTube scripts? Just film twice. But it probably is faster than putting out videos that don't quite work or get you as many views, and you need to make twice as many videos because you're rambling a bit.
Or even something that takes 3 times as long in the edit because you've got all these tangents you need to cut out. And thinking time, then you're having to go back and check, okay, if I cut this tangent, will this invalidate what I said before or after? Or it's like the load is loaded on somewhere. And maybe that extra time recording it twice saves you time on the script writing and saves you time on the editing. Who knows? But we're deep into hypothetical and like theory, I guess, at this point. But
yeah. So did you say level 3 was the fully fleshed written script?
Yeah. So basically the way I always think about it and what I've tried to do in the past is that with a level 2 script, assuming it's so you've got the setup and the payoff and you've done a few bullet points to get you from the setup to the payoff. If because you said, Jamie, you actually quite enjoy the feeling of riffing, and I'm sure that's true for a lot of people. I found like when I was recording my course, I had the guardrails, but when I was trying to riff it, I was just messing up so many times, and I found it quite a stressful experience. And so the way I think about it is like, I started writing more bullet points between, in my case, it was lessons, so it wasn't like exact setups and payoffs, but I would write bullet points, and it just, without the camera being on, I would just try presenting the thing like to the wall basically, and I would just add more bullet points until the riff became comfortable. So I was still riffing ultimately to get from the start to the end, but I had enough bullet points to kind of like, I just kept adding more bullet points until it felt natural. And basically to get to a level 3 script, it's like you essentially just keep doing that until you're as close to a word for word script as makes it comfortable for you to do.
So you're essentially kind of brain writing it. You're writing it out again and again until it's in your mind. It's not on the page, but it's kind of scripted.
Yeah, I mean, that's not what I like for the majority of clients that I've written scripts for. That's not what I've done. That's just in the more recent kind of, I would say, 6 months. And like I've written a couple of scripts for my own channel, which I've used that approach, and I found that to be quite helpful. In theory, this is how I think about it, but in practice, how do I actually do it? A lot of the time, I'm not thinking of it in terms of like, I'm going to just keep doing more bullet points until I can riff it. I am thinking I'm writing a word-for-word script because that's what I prefer. But it's like, there's just different approaches. And yeah, it just comes down to what makes the process sustainable, what makes it fun for you in the first place. I know you said, Jamie, that like, you can find riffing more fun, but then if retention is worse at the end of it, it's like, where does the enjoyment in the process come for you? Like, if maybe there is an argument for the fact that getting worse retention and overall having a channel that maybe does less well is worthwhile if you enjoy sitting down to film and talking about whatever it is you're passionate about on camera, maybe that's more preferable.
You'd end up getting more videos out as well.
Well, that's true.
I mean, I think like after this conversation, I'm going to go and write this script. Like, I just feel way more energized about the thought of it. So I think we've probably done a good job here. I'll be rewatching this every time I want to write a script. Because I'm like, no, nice. In my head now, I'm like, this morning it was staring at a blinking cursor in Notion and be like, okay, what do I want to write here? How am I going to structure this? Now I feel like, okay, I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes, right? Which is one of the action points that I took away from this. Set a timer for 10 minutes. Like, brain dump all of the things I want to talk about, right? With no structure, just put it on the paper, and within that 10-minute time frame, write down that loose structure of what are the payoffs that I want to touch on. That's the level 1 script. That's like the 80-20 for a level 1. Level 2, if I wanted to, I then put in the setup, and then at that point, I think I would potentially call it a day, because I would have my PPP framework for the hook that I mentioned earlier. I would then have 3 setups and payoffs with very loose bullet points in between. That's going to give me the guardrails, right? So I can then riff in between. I imagine like that's it. Like, that's got me.
That's it.
Majority of the way there. So yeah, I'm excited to write this now.
Nice. Oh, I'm pleased. That's a great summary as well. Yeah, like if you're listening to this, go away and do that. Just do exactly what Jamie just said.
I hope you enjoyed. If you did, you might want to check out this other episode where I break down my process for coming up with repeatable video ideas that get you views every single time. Enjoy.